Next, from Springfield, we talked to Dr. Brent Clark, the Executive Director for the Illinois Association of School Administrators, as we ask him how administrators are operating without a school funding formula. We also get his thoughts on the governor's amendatory veto of the recent school finance bill. This runs about 20 minutes.
Dr. Brent Clark, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois channel. And as we stand here, the legislature, which I think everyone who follows politics would understand, we're having this another battle. We got rid of the budget, but now it's a question of funding education. On the question of SB-1, Senate Bill 1, which is a funding formula for the state. It was passed by the legislature. It was vetoed by the governor, and at this point, the Senate has overridden that veto.
Right.
But schools are opening. We still don't have a funding formula.
Right.
As the Association of School Administrators, how are administrators dealing in this environment where you don't even know what your funding is going to be?
It is indescribable. There's no history pattern that we have to look back on and follow. We've gone back as far as the Great Depression to try to figure out what they did then, and we found some school districts were paying teachers with wooden nickels. And I can't imagine using the wooden nickel program today in this economy in 2017. It's just unprecedented where we're at.
Do you have a count on as you look across the state? I mean, school districts are going to be in all kinds of different financial situations. Some can go the whole year without finances, but how many are really in a critical short-term financial bind?
The very picture of those that can go the whole year versus those that are literally figuring out here how many days they can stay open is indicative of the school funding formula we've been operating under. It's what's driven the difference between the haves and the have-nots, between those that have equity, those that are far below equity and adequacy. It's the picture, if you will, that the current formula has delivered to Illinois, where you've got 80% of your districts far below what they adequately need. So school administrators are trying to figure out days of cash on hand. They're trying to figure out how many dollars are they spending every day, how many days does that translate into. Can they borrow from the local bank on a line of credit? When does their tax money come into them so they can have that at least to spend and burn days, buy days, if you will, for the school year? But at some point, many of them are going to run out of that local cash. We've got districts that are in the September range. I've got one that's much closer than that. They're concerned if they can get through the end of August. So we've got a couple that are really early in the process of how far they can go, and certainly a bunch that are in trouble in late September.
When we go through the back and forth, and there's been a lot of politics on this whole thing on both sides, and I'll say for the audience, you're a nonpartisan organization.
We
so
are,
when you,
absolutely.
When you cite certain things, you're not being critical from a political standpoint, but from your standpoint of being a school administrator and what you think works and not. Without getting into the weeds too much on the back and forth political arguments, the governor, just to make clear to people, after the bill was passed, the governor made an amendatory veto, which meant that he changed some of the language of the bill, and then the legislature can either accept it or reject it. The Senate rejected it already. From the changes the governor made, what is your reaction, and as one who's been deeply involved in educational issues over the years? Well,
the bill was 463 pages roughly, and by my count there were 102 changes that he made to that bill, and he eviscerated the heart, the intention, and the protections that were put into that bill to refurbish the schools over the long term. I heard one analyst say, the AV is akin to a shot of Red Bull to a starving man, and the SB-1 was a long-term nutritional program. And it really did go in and try to distract people with inflated numbers in the first year to get them to take that bait, if you will, and forego then all of the benefits and safeguards, guardrails, if you will, that we built into the system to really bring schools back that have been so poorly deteriorated financially over the last 20 years in Illinois.
So when the governor is going out and giving his speeches that he has been giving, he will cite that Springfield will get so much more money, this district will get so much more money, but you're saying that's a short-term fix.
It is.
In outer years, that's not going to be there.
It is, absolutely. I mean, if the old saying is, if you rob Peter to pay Paul, then it's not hard to figure out that Paul's going to get more as a result of Peter losing. And that's exactly what's happening in the amendatory veto. You're taking money from one set of children and giving it to another set of children, of essentially pitting one child against another child. That's just bad public policy for a state like Illinois, and we're a huge diverse state. We ought to recognize that and step away from the divisiveness that's been perpetrated and try to come together around something that really does build our schools in a classy way going forward.
And again, I'm not saying, I'm just going to be saying what Speaker Madigan said yesterday, not to be defending or opposing what he's saying, but Speaker Madigan said they're going to take an override vote next Wednesday, the 23rd of August, that I think his words were, we are not going to walk away from SB-1, and that this has taken years of work. SB-1 was a reflection of years of work. How is SB-1, which does change the funding formula, you touched on that earlier on, how does it change it? And I know you can't go into all the different ways, but how is it overall a better formula than what we had? And if we could, let's then also touch on some of the things the amendatory veto did, and were there any good parts in the amendatory veto, or just some negatives?
I would say that at the highest levels, what does SB-1 do, and what's the change effectively do, is it causes the state of Illinois to send its money to the districts that need it the most. We do not have that today. We're still sending money to districts that don't necessarily need it. They have an adequate amount on hand to educate their kids. In today's formula, SB-1 changes that, and it says state money goes to the kids that need it the most. That's the change. Now, it takes a lot to make that happen mechanically and mathematically, but that's the change. And then to the point about the AV, there were a lot of things taken out that were built in on purpose. So I've got a list here. I cannot recall all of these without looking at a list, but it eliminated what we call an annual recalibration of the adequacy target, which simply means this: over the course of time, it's normal that your cost of doing business when you're running a school, you're employing people, you're buying products, your cost of business is going to creep upward. This SB-1 recognizes that. The governor's amendatory veto eliminates that annual recalibration. He called that a cost saver. Well, yes, if you hang today's cost and we're 10 years down the road and we're still hanging on today's cost, of course it would be a cost saver, but it's also inaccurate, and it's unfair to school districts to be pegged with a number that's ancient, like we have today. Second thing is it deleted what we call a proration protection. So for the last 8 years, districts have been subjected to a discounted amount of state aid coming to them. We'll promise you X, but we'll give you 90% of X. So that's they call it proration, which is a really smooth word for we're cutting your funding. So we had proration protections built in for the districts that could least afford to be prorated. So that's all removed from the bill. It created a hold harmless on a per pupil basis instead of a hold harmless on a district-wide basis. Now, there's clearly an argument to be made there on in the governor's defense about not sending money to follow ghost students. But the counter to that is that if you went to the hold harmless per pupil, you would effectively be reducing contributions, state contributions, to districts that we have determined to be below their adequate amount. The deal, if you will, the hybrid ground there, the middle ground, would be to simply say, leave people in a district-wide hold harmless until they reach adequacy, then switch to per pupil. That way you're ensured that you're not spending any more dollars than necessary to any school district. That's the way to deal with that, his opinion and SB-1's opinion. There's middle ground on that item. The fourth thing that it changed, big item, would be, again, 102 changes, but these are the big categories. The fourth major category was what we call a pension cost shift change, and that is what's called Tier 3. Tier 3 teachers will be coming into our system soon, and all of the pension cost, all the retirement costs, if you will, for those Tier 3 teachers will be the responsibility of each local school district. Today, under the day system, the state is a partner in paying a portion of the cost for teacher pensions. Certainly, local teachers and school districts pay a portion, and the state pays a portion. But in going forward, under Tier 3, all new teachers will be the sole responsibility of a local school district. The state of Illinois will be getting out of the pension business. He removed that pension protection for the school districts in his amendatory veto. That's a major financial piece, not in the first year, but as you go out, that compounded effect financially really becomes a big deal.
And if I might insert there, it would seem to me that then that would drive up local property taxes,
Without question.
which is exactly what he says he's trying to cut.
Without question, it will drive up local costs, which you have to gain those monies from somewhere.
Right.
And the only place we've been able to get that is local property taxes. And by the way, for the record, superintendents do not like to raise local property taxes. If SB-1 is implemented over a long term with fidelity, there is a path forward where superintendents could lower, in conjunction with their community, lower the tax burden that they've had to levy locally in so many places. The fifth major area is it erased what we called a minimum funding level. Because we've got experience in dealing with the General Assembly, we built into the law that in future years, there's a minimum funding level that the General Assembly would have to put in to the formula. You couldn't just get by with giving us 90% of X or 88% of X or 91% of X. You'd have to put a minimum funding into the formula so schools could count on their revenues for the next year. We're required by law to make personnel decisions in March and April. We hardly have ever been given a budget before May 31st, and now the last 2 or 3 years it's drug out into the summer. Here we are, August the 17th, still wondering what it's going to be. So we put in a minimum funding level and said we're going to help these districts be able to plan for programs and people at the right times of the year and not be hung literally the week school starting still wondering what the budget's going to look like. So that was in our SB-1. That was removed in the amendatory veto. A big underlying principle, the next item on the list, a big underlying principle was this idea that no district could lose money. We've seen efforts to pass school funding reform where we took from one district and gave to another. Those have failed. Those have failed because the public policy just didn't pass the smell test. Well, SB-1 says no district loses dollars. Everyone starts at least where the beginning point, if you will. They're held harmless at that point. And in the amendatory veto, I believe there were 26 districts, I believe, that lost money under the amendatory veto. That's a no-go for us. That creates what we call red numbers. You'll hear us talk about no red numbers.
And red numbers mean that their budget is going down.
Their revenues from the state of Illinois is going down.
And by the way, let me, for the people who don't need the terminology, hold harmless, would say to a school district, whatever your funding was, you're not going to get less than that.
That's correct, in terms of state funding.
Right.
That doesn't impact local money or federal money, that's just state money. We're trying to hold that in a status position if you're losing enrollment.
And SB-1 has a hold harmless, but is it just a 1-year hold harmless?
No, it is not. It's a perpetual hold harmless, knowing that as we move districts upward and toward adequacy, then that hold harmless provision becomes less and less important because we're moving them, advancing them, if you will, on a per pupil basis toward their adequacy targets. So hold harmless over time then sort of takes care of itself. The next item is that was in the amendatory veto that bothered us greatly was the capping of regionalization costs. I think most people recognize in Illinois it just costs more money to live in the suburbs in Cook County. And we recognized that in SB-1, and we gave them some credit for that when we calculated their adequacy targets. The amendatory veto reduced that by 2%, which would effectively mean they're going to get a false adequacy target, and they're going to have to raise more money locally, again going back to raising more property taxes to reach what they really need, or raise what they really need for adequate targets. So that was a problem. It affected 313 school districts. And then finally, the most bizarre part of the amendatory veto was this piece where we had to artificially count the wealth that existed inside TIF districts, which are known as tax increment financing districts. They're used for economic development by counties and cities and municipalities, and count the artificial wealth that's suppressed in PTEL counties, which are property tax extension limitation laws. Those two laws, TIF and PTEL, are by design crafted so that school districts cannot reach in there, tax that, and access that money out and spend it in their school. That PTEL is simply suppressed. You cannot access it. It stays with the taxpayer. TIF, the money is not accessible by the school, but it's accessible by the municipality for redevelopment of blighted areas and building roads and refurbishing buildings and trying
you may have a building
drive economic development.
Yeah, a community, let's say Peoria, is redeveloped their business riverfront. Now they have all kinds of businesses but they would have used maybe a TIF money to have that going.
No question, and that's all over Illinois. I think it affected 574 school districts, just the TIF and the PTEL piece, and that was just really bizarre because it was going to artificially inflate the adequacy amount that a school district allegedly had when there's by law prohibition from going and getting that money to spend it.
I know it's easy for people who don't deal with these issues to get lost, so I'm just going to restate it. If you had, as an example, $100 million of property value in a TIF district, the school district cannot tax that $100 million. The governor's
That's
saying,
correct.
we want you to count that $100 million because you're the guys that are taking the $100 million of property off the books for your school district.
But he was incorrect in that regard. School districts do not create, generate, or manage TIF districts. Those are generally run by counties, cities, and municipalities. School districts have a history of wanting to work with their local mayors, their local county chairman, to try to help with economic development. I think that's an underlying issue for all of us, trying to help our state grow. School districts are certainly a partner in that, and they've not been obstinate to it. They've been rather cooperative. So now to come along and punish them for that cooperative nature and economic development would be incredibly unfair. And mathematically, just the math just doesn't add up. So it just really bizarre piece of that. Now, is there an issue there that needs looked into about how those are managed? Probably so, but it's kind of its own separate issue that needs dealt with, not thrown into the final days and hours of a school funding formula.
Too big of an issue to work out in
It really
couple of
is.
days
It really
right
is at this
before
point.
school.
Yes,
right?
absolutely. It really is.
Speaker Madigan, in his press conference, said he was willing to compromise on the governor and have some discussions, although he was doubtful in his estimation if the governor was wanting to compromise. Are there any talks going on that you and other education associations are dealing with at this point? And if so, are they promising, or is it kind of more of a going nowhere?
I would say this, throughout June and some of July, there were many talks, and we served as a technical advisor to both parties, giving them both the same information so that as they negotiated with one another, and at least in what we were providing, they were working off of factual pieces. We certainly weren't party to that. That was strictly held between the caucuses themselves. I think they tried. I just don't think they could get to an agreement. I'm not sure what totally held that up. I've got my own assumptions, but that's personal. That's an opinion and not a fact, so I won't state that here. I do know the leaders of all four caucuses, Leader Designee Brady, Senate President Cullerton, Speaker Madigan, and Leader Durkin are scheduled to meet tomorrow in Chicago to see if they can iron out the final pieces and differences, if you will, to bring this to final resolution. I don't know if they'll get it done or not. I really don't. What I saw back in July when we were trying to finalize the budget and revenue was actual legislators working amongst themselves to kind of get it worked out. And it will not surprise me if that's how this ends up again, is the legislators themselves, outside of the leaders, actually working it out.
Dr. Brent Clark, it's been very involved. We appreciate you giving us the details. I think
Yes.
that was undercovered
Yes.
on the Amendatory Veto,
Yeah.
and good luck to you and the schools, and hopefully we have this resolved soon.
I hope so. I mean, I don't know of another state that's in this position with schools starting and no funding in line. I mean, it's unfortunate. Our parents have to be confused. I mean, imagine. We're real close to the fire here, so we get it. But imagine being a parent 2 or 3 hours from Springfield. You've got to be shaking your head at this town. I mean, we've got a budget finally, we've got revenue finally, but now we can't figure out how to move it from Springfield to your school. That is just, it's almost a comedy show, and except it's not. It's sad. So for the hopes of the kids and the parents and our teachers, certainly our school administrators, we hope we get it resolved.
Thanks so much.
You bet.